Then look at developing an improvement plan with the supplier. So make sure that's a smart action plan with dates and key actions that the supplier needs to achieve to give them the opportunity to implement the plan and improve performance. So look at allowing some time for suppliers to implement those improvements. Think about increasing the frequency of reviews during that improvement plan as well to closely monitor performance. And then be clear on any potential consequences if there are no improvement. And then really as a last resort, looking at things like liquidated damages or potential termination of the contract. So if the suppliers don't improve, then we can invoke liquidated damages or termination clauses. But the key point to remember here with liquidated damages is that it must be a genuine pre-estimate of the loss that you've suffered. So it should put you back into the position that you would have been in had the supplier not underperformed. There can't be a penalty clause. Anything to add on that one, Nigel, briefly before we move on?
Not really. Well, you've covered that very well, I think. Only to say that sometimes when we've carried out performance reviews, it's better to do it on a one-to-one basis to allow people to speak freely, because sometimes it can be the client that's causing the problem. So they're just, in the performance reviews, they're just saying what people think they should be saying, and probably not getting the opportunity to, feel free to express themselves. So I think one-to-ones are often quite a good way of dealing with that, anonymously, but bringing all the information together, and then you can see often a bit of a pattern with these things. But I think really that's all I wanted to add, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next topic, and really following on the same theme, is early termination of the contract is required. So what do you do in this situation? And it really should be a last resort, but sometimes termination of the contract is unavoidable. So it could be due to poor performance, or it could be for business reasons such as takeover or merger if you find that there's duplicate provision in place and you want to streamline provision. There could be poor performance, or there could be disputes that lead to that need to terminate, but really we'd encourage exhausting all other options before you look at termination. So really refer to the termination clauses within the contract to make sure you understand the termination mechanism, how that works, and to make sure you have grounds to terminate. And take some legal advice. So when you think that termination might be a real possibility, take legal advice before communicating with the supplier, because you need to ensure that you take all the actions to comply with the contract and to avoid any further potential issues down the line. And the last thing that lawyers want is that you go to them and say, well, I've already told the supplier that we're going to terminate this contract. I'm sure they'll tell you that that probably wasn't the best approach. So many standard forms of contract do include non-fault walk-away termination clauses, but they're not cost-free. So think about calculating any potential costs of termination before you invoke that clause. And there can be lengthy termination periods. I think with JCT, standard termination is 13 weeks, so you've got quite a lead-in time to that. And with NEC, it's potentially longer, and there's other standard forms as well with those termination clauses included. As we've already said, in the case of poor performance or material breach, ensure you've got the evidence in place. So through your performance management mechanism, make sure you collect and record evidence of the breaches, ensure your reviews have taken place, and ensure the suppliers have been given opportunity to improve or rectify the breach if it can be rectified. And it always kind of makes me smile, this one, because I always remember somebody coming to me and saying, oh, I want to get rid of this supplier, they're rubbish. And I said, okay, so have you had them in and spoken to them? No, I just want to get rid of them, they're rubbish. Okay, so have you got any evidence of the performance? Have you been collecting any data? No, they're just rubbish, I want to get rid of them. So clearly that's a difficult message to get the supplier in and tell them that you're going to terminate the contract if you haven't had any previous conversations, you haven't collected any information, you've got no evidence to support that performance. You're kind of going to be on the back foot before you start, so obviously we want to avoid that situation. And then think about having a contingency plan in place. So if you are going to go down the termination route and there are no other options available, it's likely that the supplier, once you tell them that you are going to terminate the contract, they're not going to be particularly on board with continuing to perform that contract and fulfil their obligations. So ensure that you're prepared for this and you've got a contingency plan in place. So do you have an alternative supplier? Do you have an in-house option that you could use? And then think about any possible disputes down the line as well, and make sure you plan for dealing with any disputes. Kind of plan for the worst, make sure you've got the evidence, make sure you do everything in accordance with the contract, and be prepared for those challenges. And then what about if the supplier wants to terminate? So if the shoe is on the other foot and the supplier decides that they want to walk away from the contract, again, maybe think about taking legal advice at the earliest opportunity. Determine what's the best way to deal with that, and understand why the supplier wants to terminate, because there may be changes that you can make and you may be able to come to a solution with the supplier that prevents that course of action. So take some time to consider your position as well and develop that contingency plan. If the supplier wants to end the contract, it might be better to agree a mutually acceptable position rather than trying to fight it. So that is worth considering. But just as a final point on this one, it's good to include some of your critical contracts in your business continuity planning, so you do have those contingencies already in place. So what would you do if the supplier couldn't deliver or they did walk away? And as we've seen recently as well, a lot of suppliers going into liquidation. It's really important to have those business continuity plans in place to address some of these situations. Anything on that one, Nigel, before we move on to the next one?
You covered that very well. I think just to reiterate maybe a couple of the points you made, but it is very important to keep these records, written records, and if you are giving any notifications, they must also be in writing. There's no verbally notifying them that perhaps they're not performing and you're thinking about termination, so it has to be in writing. And sometimes that has to be by recorded delivery as well, so just check the contract. But coming back to the point you raised earlier, that if it is a possibility that the client or the contractor may want to terminate, then you can put provision into the contract to do that. So, for example, if something becomes obsolete or not required, or the budget is no longer available, then put some proper terms in the contract to be able to do that, as you said earlier. So if it is envisaged that 5 or 10-year term may not necessarily be needed, then you need to think about how that's going to work before you enter into the contract. Yeah, good.
Thank you. Sorry, just another point that's come to mind, it's just worth mentioning. So in some of the standard forms of contract, there are timescales for responding to notices as well. It's very important that you respond within those timescales, so if the supplier does give an early warning or a notice to terminate. That was just a final point. So thank you. The next topic is that bidders request substantial changes to the contract terms. So during the tender process or post-tender submission, they may submit their own standard terms in response to a tender. Things like financial services, auditors, legal firms have their own terms of engagement that they are quite sensitive about moving away from. And this resolution gives you some things to think about to try to prevent that scenario from happening. So before you start your procurement process, be aware of any areas of the contract that might be contentious. So things like intellectual property rights, liability limits, damages clauses, we could put them in as to be agreed, so the figures could be suggested and they could be agreed with the winning bidder once the contract is being awarded. So again, just some things to think about, really, to try and avoid that situation in the first instance before we look at a resolution. So generally the suppliers do have red lines when it comes to certain contract terms, and there are some things that most suppliers won't accept. So restrictions around ownership of IPR created during the performance of the contract. Unlimited liability clauses are always very unpopular, and any particular onerous clauses around insurance, indemnity, or restricted or one-sided termination clauses would probably cause concern. And things around parent company guarantees or other forms of guarantee and bond as well can be particularly sensitive issues. Excuse me. So before you go out to procurement, think about whether the contract terms are reasonable. Before issuing your tender, consider whether the contract has an equitable share of risk. Again, passing all of the risk down the supply chain to the supplier could cause an issue and cause some changes to the terms and conditions to be requested. So consider using standard forms of contracts where this is appropriate. Suppliers will be more familiar with the standard form, and there's likely to be fewer questions or changes during the tender process. If changes are requested, are they material or can some be accepted? So if some are incidental, maybe you can accept those, or go back and challenge the need for the changes if you do think that they are incidental to the contract. Try not to get too hung up on the trivial points and focus on the critical changes. And then for public sector, you do need to consider whether you can make the changes post-tender if material changes are not permitted. Nigel, do you have any points on that while I just cough? Thank you.
Okay, well, you got on with your coffee. One thing I would think about if you are going to introduce any, let's say, new terms or potentially unacceptable terms, you could soft market test these with the market to see whether they would be acceptable. So, for example, if you are introducing some new insurance provisions into your contracts, then again, you might want to test that with the market first of all and see what the market has to say about that. And secondly, and I think this is perhaps a bit of a plug for our company, is experience, because you can tell very often whether something is actually going to be unacceptable to the market from experience you've had in the past, where clauses haven't worked or where people have had difficulty with them. So you can draw on your experiences most of the time to see whether this is actually going to be something that is going to be acceptable or not. And as Jenny said, if you're sticking to the standard forms, certainly in construction circles, the standard forms are written in user-friendly terms and balanced risk. So that tends to work best, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Hopefully I can get through this next one. So this is the last topic for this first section. So a bidder submits a variant tender proposal. And this could actually be viewed in a positive light because it shows the supplier has given some thought to delivery of the contract and maybe a potentially better solution for delivery. But is it the best option for you or is it the best option for them? So when you look at the variant tender proposal, what's the difference from your specification and your requirements? And is it an option that you want to consider? And then think about how you can evaluate it against other bids and against the evaluation criteria that you set out in the tender. So can the price be adjusted in some way to make it a like-for-like comparison? I think that's always the issue with variant tenders, is how do you compare them like-for-like with your compliant tenders? So think about whether the contract terms are the same. Does the variant meet the technical specification that you've put out? And if not, do you discount it from the tender assessment process? And then look at the delivery methodology, and does it give you a viable alternative? Is it actually a better solution? Is it a more efficient solution? And then look at the pricing model, and fundamentally, does the proposal still meet your requirements? So then think about whether that variant is beneficial. So is it something that you want to consider? So sometimes you can dismiss the variant tender. So for example, there was something that was submitted to an organisation that I was working for, and we'd asked for fixed pricing initially for 12 months and then price increases that were index linked thereafter. But we received a variant bid that fixed prices at a lower rate, but only for the initial 3-month period, and then the price change mechanism beyond that wasn't defined within the variant bid. So for the initial 3 months of the contract, yes, it was a better solution, but then beyond that, we couldn't really assess the pricing and we did dismiss the tender and said that's not something that we could consider. So is the variant in improved technical specification? So there could be a bid that's slightly more expensive initially, but over the life of the equipment, it could give you an additional maybe 2 to 3 years of operation of that item, which obviously over the life of the contract will be beneficial. And that's going to lead on to something that we're going to talk about in the next section, which is about whole life costing. So then evaluate the variant bid against your evaluation criteria and compare it to the compliant bids. using that original criteria to quantify whether it does offer better value for money. And that could be something that's quite difficult because it might need some adjustment to make sure it's a like-for-like comparison, and it may be that you need to go back and clarify some aspects with the bidder. And then document the reasons for accepting or rejecting the variance, so you've got that audit trail and you can see exactly why the decision's being made. And then give feedback to the supplier on the reasons for your decision. So we don't want to discourage them for thinking carefully and giving us alternative proposals about how they can meet our requirements, because actually that is showing some degree of innovation, which we really want to encourage. So any points on that one, Nigel, before we move to the first Q&A?
Not really. I think if you are going to allow variant bids, I think that needs to be clear in the instructions to tenderers so that they understand whether that's an acceptable thing to do. And in my experience, saying that, for example, you can only submit a variant bid if you submit a compliant bid. So you have to submit a compliant bid along with the variant bid for the variant bid to be considered. And I suppose if what you're really looking for is innovation from the bidders, then you might, in the public sector, you might want to move to something more like a different way of tendering that. So maybe competitive dialogue, for example, if you really want to see what the market has to offer rather than allow variant bids. Yeah. So.
Thank you. Adi, do we have any questions?
Yes, we've got one question for John and one question that I can answer, but nothing technical. So the first question is, our whole attendance based in Hereford and Worcester besides the Scotland one. And John, are you going to be able to answer that? You're mute.
I think the problem is that the only list of participants we have is the person's name, so we don't really know where they're from, and I think there's a restricted amount of information that CIPS can give out. So that's a really difficult one to answer unless somebody actually asks something in chat or something.
It'd be nice to know where people are. If you want to pop a message in the chat to let us know where you are, that would be great, and then everybody can see that as well.
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting.
Yeah, somebody said they're from the Park in Scotland, so we know that one of them is not from there. That's one out of.
I can see the chat going mad now.
Yeah. Somebody's from the West.
Midlands, Walsall.
And the second question is, are we able to get a copy of these slides? The answer to that is yes, because if you send, I'll put the John's email address in there. You will need to send an email to John.
Yeah.
john.mills@ncica.com. But I'll type in John's email address in response to this question.
Yes,
we've all really.
Thank you. We've sent a PDF of the slides, so yes, we're happy to make those available after the session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll carry on. If you do have any questions, carry on putting them into the Q&A. Thank you. So the second section, first topic, how do you evaluate whole of life costs? And I think this is one it can be quite an interesting subject. So if we're thinking about the purchase of a physical asset, then the costs involved are relatively easy to quantify. So you pretty much know your capital costs. You can possibly identify any sourcing costs, maintenance and operating costs. You will know the life expectancy of the asset and hopefully disposal costs. So for those kind of physical things, it's probably slightly easier to put a ring around it and identify the cost over the life of that asset. But then if we think about things like construction, where there's a whole host of potential other costs, and as a lot of people will probably know, contractors don't like to price a fixed price contract because there are so many unknowns and things that can happen during the construction period. And we're now seeing clients considering the building running costs in the design and planning and feasibility stage. and involving their maintenance or their FM contractors in that design stage. So we are now moving to seeing clients thinking about that whole of life cost of running a building and trying to design in some efficiencies, operational efficiencies at the beginning of the process. And then again, thinking about services, is it easy to quantify what the whole of life cost of the service is? So is it as easy as saying we need X number of hours or transactions a month for Y number of months? But then what about operational changes or seasonal fluctuations? So if we think about a grounds maintenance contract, obviously that's very seasonal, but there could be changes during the life of that contract. So you may decide that you're going to, not very sustainable I know, but you're going to concrete over a lot of grassed areas, which will reduce the maintenance cost. Or you may decide that you're going to invest in wildlife gardens and planting, which is going to increase the grounds maintenance cost. So planning for things like that and assessing that cost at the beginning is maybe quite difficult. And software is probably a great example of this as well. So thinking up front about how many licenses you're going to need, how many training sessions you're going to need, how many optional modules are there for a piece of software that you might need just to get one bit of functionality. You might end up with lots of other bits of functionality that you don't really need. So how do we go about assessing all of that? So when we're thinking about building a model to evaluate the whole of life costs, it could be something as simple as a spreadsheet, or it could be a piece of software, but as long as it meets the needs of your organisation and it delivers what you want, it doesn't really matter what that model looks like. So try to think about including all of your known quantifiable costs, which is probably the easy bit when we're looking at the purchasing costs, the cost of training. Some of the maintenance and operational costs might be a bit easier. But then also try to include an allowance for the unquantifiable costs, so it's kind of the known unknowns, which you might need to test and you might need to agree and record your assumptions for those costs. And then also further down the line, you can remember why you included a £1 million contingency sum for something that you thought was going to happen but maybe didn't. And then think about allowing for inflation and depreciation over the life of the contract and any costs that are going to change over time. So again, the grounds maintenance example, if you think the service is going to change, try to allow for that. And then it might be just a case of modelling different options and different scenarios, different contract durations. And there may be an optimum point where you find that your maintenance costs increase and that asset or that service has kind of exceeded its useful life, and it would make sense to go out and replace that or re-tender the service. And then model different options and with different assumptions to test and assess the impact of those. And there really is no right and wrong answer here. It is a little bit of trial and error, and it is quite a lot of modelling. So I think if you're good at maybe doing some sums, playing around with a spreadsheet and looking at different options and different scenarios, we can come up with something that will stand up to scrutiny and will stand up to the test and show that you have considered that whole life cost of the asset or the purchase. And I think the more we do this, the kind of better we get at it, and it is still developing over time. And although it's something that a lot of people do look at, the models and the kind of freely available models are not really there, or have not come across any particularly good ones. So if people do have one that they're willing to share, then please let us know.